Deputy Sheriff Mark Reynolds and his loyal German Shepherd Ranger thought it was just another stormy night in Riverbend until they opened the station door, and froze lying in the rain was Ethan Walker, a haunted veteran who had collapsed in silence. His eyes, when they fluttered open, carried shadows of wars long past, and in his pocket was a bundle of letters that whispered of secrets darker than the storm itself. Why had this broken soldier come to their doorstep? Who was chasing him through the storm, and what truth was so dangerous that someone wanted him silenced forever? What followed that night would unravel betrayal, hidden crimes, and the fragile hope of redemption. What happens next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. The town of Riverbend, Montana, lay buried beneath a curtain of black storm clouds. Wind swept through the narrow streets, rattling the loose shutters of old wooden houses. Rain lashed against rooftops, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that snaked toward the swollen riverbanks. In the heart of town, where the main street widened to a small square, the sheriff's substation stood, an aging stone building with peeling paint and a single lamp flickering against the downpour. Inside, Deputy Sheriff Mark Reynolds fought to stay awake during what had promised to be a long, uneventful night. Mark was 35, a tall, lean man with storm-gray eyes and hair the color of wet bark. He wore a heavy navy patrol jacket lined with wool, the kind of garment necessary to face Montana winters. His upbringing had been modest, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, both long gone now. The job of deputy sheriff had become his calling, though some nights it felt less like justice and more like endurance against silence. Tonight, however, silence was a luxury the storm refused to grant. By his side rested Ranger, his 5-year-old German Shepherd. Ranger had once been a proud K-9 officer trained for drug busts and crowd control, but after an injury in service, he had been retired. Mark had adopted him, unable to let go of the partner who had saved his life more than once. Ranger's coat was black and tan, his eyes sharp and alert, and he had a way of sensing trouble before Mark ever did. Now, the dog lay curled on the floor, ears twitching at every thunderclap. The storm was at its peak when Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking forward. He gave a low growl, the kind that stirred the hair on Mark's neck. Mark glanced up from his desk, the dim lamp flickering, and frowned. Ranger padded to the door, tail stiff, and let out a sharp bark. Mark stood, slipping on his gloves. "Easy, boy. Let's see what you found." He unlatched the door against the wind, and the storm seemed to push its way inside. There, crumpled on the wooden steps of the substation, lay a man. Rain pooled around him, soaking through a tattered military coat that clung to his gaunt frame. His boots were caked in mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, and a beard hid most of his weary features. He was no vagrant, though. There was something deliberate about the way he had dragged himself this far. Mark crouched beside him. The man stirred faintly, opening eyes clouded with exhaustion and pain. His lips moved and a faint whisper escaped, ragged and broken. "They're watching in the dark." The man's name, as Mark would soon learn, was Ethan Walker. Ethan was 42, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. He had once been a sergeant, decorated for bravery, but the years had left their mark. His posture was bent, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands shook even in unconscious tremors. The worn military coat he wore had lost its insignia. Only faded stitching remained, ghosts of a life spent in uniform. Ethan had returned from the battlefield with scars invisible to most PTSD, a wound that never truly healed. Mark eased him up, grunting at the man's weight. "Hang in there, buddy," Ranger whined, circling close as if urging Mark to hurry. Together, man and dog pulled Ethan inside. The storm raged on, lightning flashing against the walls, but as Mark laid Ethan on the old leather bench inside the office, the overhead lights flickered and went dead. The storm had knocked out the power. Darkness wrapped the room, broken only by the thunder outside. Mark cursed under his breath, then reached under his desk. His fingers brushed against a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a lantern, old and worn. the kind his father once used on hunting trips. Mark struck a match and the lantern flared to life, bathing the office in a dim amber glow. The sight of the flame brought an unexpected comfort, but it also cast long dancing shadows on the walls. Ethan stirred again, his face tightening in fear. "They'll come. Shadows. Behind me." His words tumbled out half-coherent, a mind caught between nightmare and reality. Mark leaned closer. "Who's coming?" "Ethan, you need to stay with me." But Ethan's eyes rolled back, his body going limp again, leaving Mark with only the echo of his warning. Ranger pressed his head against Ethan's arm, whimpering softly, as if recognizing the torment in the man's fractured state. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He studied Ethan, wondering how far the man had come and what demons chased him through the night. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that made the small station feel like a cabin in the wilderness rather than a place of law. Outside, the storm pounded harder, as though testing the walls. Mark sat back slowly, his hand resting on Ranger's head. "Looks like the night just got longer, boy." The dog's eyes glimmered in the lantern light, watchful and ready. Whatever Ethan Walker had brought with him out of the storm, Mark Reynolds knew it was only the beginning. The lantern burned low in the sheriff's substation, its light flickering across the walls as the storm outside hammered on. Mark sat at his desk, his jacket still damp from dragging Ethan Walker inside. The man lay stretched out on the leather bench, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms. Ranger remained close, lying on the floor, but keeping his amber eyes fixed on Ethan as if watching over him. A sudden clap of thunder split the sky. Ethan jerked upright with a hoarse cry, his eyes wide and unfocused. His body trembled violently, sweat mixing with rainwater still clinging to his coat. Mark was at his side instantly, steadying him by the shoulder. "Easy, you're safe." "You're at the sheriff's office in Riverbend." Ethan's gaze darted around the room, wild with confusion before slowly recognizing where he was. His hands twitched as though gripping a rifle that wasn't there, and then he slumped forward, clutching his head. "They don't stop," he muttered, his voice raw. "Even in my dreams, the sand, the noise, the blood, it follows me here." Mark studied him carefully. He had dealt with drunks, vagrants, and troubled teenagers, but this was something else. He had seen soldiers come back from the Middle East, friends of his who had worn the same uniform, and some carried scars far deeper than bullets could ever leave. Ethan was one of them. "Tell me your name," Mark said firmly, keeping his tone steady. "Ethan Walker," came the strained reply. He was 42, though he looked older, years of combat carved into the lines of his face. His beard was patchy and unkempt, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. The old army coat hanging on his frame seemed to weigh him down more than protect him. "I served Afghanistan. Too long. Too many nights without sleep." Mark nodded slowly, resting back on his heels. "All right, Ethan. You're not alone tonight. This is Ranger." He motioned toward the dog, who lifted his head and wagged his tail slightly before scooting closer. Ethan's shaking hand reached out, brushing the dog's fur. Ranger pressed against him, solid and warm, and for a moment Ethan seemed anchored to the present. Thunder rolled again, and Ethan flinched, pulling his hand back, his breathing quickened. "They've been following me," he whispered, his voice catching. "Weeks now. Every town, every mile I walk, I feel them at my back. Shadows in the street, eyes in the alleys. Nobody believes me, but they're real. They want what I carry. They want me gone." Mark leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "Who?" "Who's following you? I don't know their names." "Just men, tall, faceless in the dark. They don't talk, they just watch. Always close enough that I feel them. Sometimes I hear boots in the mud, sometimes whispers I can't place. And when I turn, nothing. But I know they're there. I know it." Ethan's voice cracked and he buried his face in his hands. Mark placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his tone calm but firm. "You're safe inside these walls. Whatever's outside won't touch you here. You have my word." As though to punctuate his words, Ranger suddenly stiffened. His ears shot upright, and a deep growl rumbled from his throat. He rose, hackles bristling, and stared at the rain-smeared window. The lantern's glow cast a faint reflection against the glass, but beyond it the storm churned, and shadows twisted in the darkness. Mark stood quickly, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered revolver. "What is it, boy?" Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoing through the room. Lightning flared outside, flooding the office with brief, stark light. For an instant, Mark thought he saw movement. A figure slipping past the window, too fast to be certain. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. "I told you," he whispered. "They found me." Mark moved to the window, peering out into the sheets of rain. Nothing but the storm greeted him. Empty streets, water pooling in the gutters, branches bending under the gale. Yet the sensation of being watched clung to him, prickling the back of his neck. He turned back to Ethan, who now sat rigid on the bench, clutching his knees as if bracing for attack. Mark knew he had to tread carefully. The man was fragile, teetering between sanity and terror, but his fear was too specific, too raw to dismiss as simple delusion. "Listen," Mark said, his voice steady. "If someone's after you, we'll figure it out. But, right now, you need rest. Let Ranger and me keep watch. You're safe for tonight." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the dog again. Ranger's eyes remained locked on the window, his growl low but persistent. Finally, Ethan nodded slightly, though his shoulders never relaxed. Mark set the lantern on the desk, its dim light stretching shadows across the floor. He pulled up a chair beside the bench, settling in for a long night. The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the glass, and in the spaces between, Mark could hear Ethan's ragged breathing, the restless shifting of a man trapped in his own memories. The minutes bled into hours. Sometimes Ethan drifted into half-sleep, mumbling fragments of battles long past, names of comrades, orders shouted in desert heat, pleas for help that had never come. Sometimes he jolted awake with a gasp, eyes wild, until Ranger's steady presence drew him back. Each time Ethan opened his eyes, he repeated the same warning in a dozen broken ways. "They're watching. They're close." Mark didn't know whether to believe him, but when Ranger suddenly barked again, sharper this time, the hair rose on his arms. The storm might be hiding more than thunder and rain. The storm eased toward dawn, though rain still poured steadily over Riverbend. The streets gleamed like rivers of tar beneath the lamplight, every puddle reflecting the town's ghostly silence. Inside the substation, the lantern continued its faint glow, throwing long shadows across the walls. Mark leaned against the window frame, eyes fixed on the street outside, listening for what Ranger seemed to sense. When the dog finally settled, Mark grabbed his raincoat and stepped out into the storm. He trusted Ranger to watch Ethan inside, though the veteran had curled on the bench again, his sleep fractured by every crack of thunder. The air outside was sharp with the scent of wet earth. Mark scanned the muddy ground along the steps. It didn't take long before his gaze fell on something unusual. A trail of footprints pressed deep into the soaked ground, heavier than his own boot prints. They weren't the staggered steps of a drunk, nor the light tread of a child. These were deliberate, steady, and broad. They led away from the substation toward the side alley. Mark followed, the rain dripping from his hat brim. The trail ended abruptly at the corner where shadows pooled deepest. The mud beyond had been disturbed, as though whoever made the prints had stopped and waited, then vanished. Mark crouched, running his gloved fingers over the indentations. Fresh, less than an hour old. The storm would have washed away anything older. Someone had been watching. He straightened, eyes narrowing at the empty alley, but only the storm answered. Back inside, Ethan sat upright, his face pale in the lantern light. He had noticed Mark's absence and now stared at him with wide, haunted eyes. "You saw them, didn't you?" His voice cracked, laced with dread. "The shadows. The ones that follow." Mark peeled off his coat, shaking off rain. He didn't want to fuel Ethan's fear, but neither could he lie. There were footprints. They ended in the alley. Whoever it was didn't stay long. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "It's them. I told you, they won't stop. They want me gone. They want what I know buried forever." He rocked forward, his voice trembling, and Ranger pressed closer to him, laying his head across Ethan's knee. The man's shaking hand found the dog's fur again, grounding himself in the present. Mark opened his mouth to ask more when the phone on the desk rang, a jarring sound against the storm's backdrop. He crossed quickly and lifted the receiver. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm, professional, but edged with urgency. "Deputy Reynolds?" "This is Claire Dawson from the Riverbend Clinic. I heard from one of the townsfolk that a man collapsed near the substation last night." "A veteran," they said. Mark's brow furrowed. "That's correct." "Ethan Walker. He's here." There was a pause, then the woman spoke again, softer this time. "Ethan? I thought it might be him. Can you tell me, is he all right?" Mark glanced over his shoulder at the exhausted figure on the bench. Ethan had turned toward the sound of the voice, though he couldn't hear the words. "He's alive." "Shaken? Weak? He's been through more than most could bear." "I need to see him," Claire replied. "I know him from before. During my volunteer work at the VA hospital in Billings, he was one of my patients. Please, Deputy, he won't trust many people, but he might trust me." Mark asked her to explain further, and she did. Claire Dawson was 28, with hair the color of wheat fields tied neatly in a ponytail. Raised in Riverbend, she had left for college in Helena before training as a nurse. For 2 years, she had worked in military hospitals as a volunteer, tending to soldiers broken by war. She had seen Ethan there, though he had rarely spoken a word. His silence, his 1,000-yard stare, had stuck with her. She had returned to Riverbend last year, taking up work at the local clinic, though her heart still ached for the men and women she could not save. "I'll come by the station right away," she said. "The storm's slowing. I can walk." Mark hesitated, but agreed. If Ethan truly knew her, maybe she could calm the storm raging inside him. When Mark hung up, Ethan asked sharply, "Who was that?" "Claire Dawson," Mark answered. "A nurse. She says she knows you from Billings." At the mention of the name, Ethan's expression shifted, confusion mixed with recognition. He whispered her name under his breath, almost reverently, then looked away as though ashamed. "She shouldn't see me like this." I'm not the man she knew. Mark pulled the lantern closer, its glow steady against the darkness. "Maybe she's the one person you need to see. Someone who knows the battles you fought. Someone who understands." Ethan's lips trembled as he looked back at Ranger, who sat faithfully by his side. The storm outside seemed to soften, though in Ethan's eyes the war was still raging. Mark leaned against the desk, watching both men soldier and dog and thinking of the footprints in the mud. Someone had been outside, close enough to listen, close enough to disappear. He knew the danger wasn't gone. He also knew that by morning, more questions would arrive with Claire Dawson. The morning broke gray over Riverbend. The storm had spent the night clawing at the rooftops, but now the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The streets lay slick and empty, washed clean, yet carrying the silence of something unsettled. Inside the sheriff's substation, the lantern still flickered on Mark's desk, though pale daylight now pushed through the rain-streaked windows. Mark heard a knock at the door, gentle but firm. Ranger rose instantly, tail stiff, ears forward. Mark opened the door to find Claire Dawson standing there. She was 28, with hair the color of wheat tied into a neat ponytail. Her face was pale from the cold, cheeks pink from the damp air, but her eyes were clear and purposeful. She wore a simple gray coat over her nurse's uniform, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Her boots were scuffed, evidence that she had walked through the storm to be here. "Deputy Reynolds," she said softly. "May I come in?" Mark stepped aside. "He's inside." Not doing well. Claire entered and immediately scanned the room. Her eyes fell on Ethan, who sat hunched on the bench, his army coat still clinging to him like a second skin. He looked up at her, and recognition flickered in his weary gaze. Shame followed quickly after. "Claire," Ethan muttered, his voice gravelly. "Didn't think you'd still be here." She set her bag down and knelt beside him, her hands gentle but practiced as she checked his pulse, his pupils, the tremor in his hands. "I told you once, Ethan Walker, that you weren't a lost cause. I still believe it. But you look worse than you did in Billings." Ethan flinched at the mention of the hospital. That was another life. Should have stayed gone. "Maybe," Claire said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. "But you didn't. You're here, and that means you're meant for something more." Mark watched silently, noting how Ethan's guarded posture softened slightly under her words. Ranger edged closer, resting his head on Ethan's boot as if to remind him he wasn't alone. As Claire adjusted Ethan's coat to listen to his breathing, something slipped from the inside pocket and landed on the floor with a faint thud. A bundle of letters, yellowed with age and bound by a fraying string. Claire picked them up, frowning. "Ethan, what are these?" His face blanched. Don't open them." But she had already seen the return addresses Army divisions, military bases scattered across the country. Her brow furrowed deeper as she noticed names, dates, and signatures. She carefully untied the string and unfolded one page. The handwriting was firm, official, and chilling. Mark moved closer. "What do they say?" Claire read aloud in a low voice, "The shipment will arrive under cover of night. Report filed under classified channels. No oversight required." She scanned further. "Maintain silence. Unit Bravo 17 remains outside civilian jurisdiction." Ethan's hands shook as he reached for the papers, but Mark caught his wrist gently. "Ethan, this is evidence. What were you doing carrying these?" With a defeated sigh, Ethan leaned back against the wall. "My father—" Colonel James Walker. He was part of a unit meant to protect supply lines overseas, but he discovered shipments weren't going where they were supposed to. American weapons being sold off the books. He kept records, letters, proof. He told me once it was bigger than any single man could stop. Mark's jaw tightened. "And your father?" "He died," Ethan whispered. "Officially, a training accident. But I knew better. He left me these letters before it happened. Said if something ever happened to him, I'd know why." The room fell silent except for the patter of rain on the roof. Claire folded the letters carefully, her face pale. "This is dangerous, Ethan. These aren't just memories. They're evidence of a crime. Someone would kill to keep this buried." As if to punctuate her words, Ranger moved suddenly, trotting to Ethan's torn backpack lying near the bench. The dog pawed at the worn fabric until something slipped free, a crumpled piece of paper. He carried it in his jaws to Mark, who unfolded it. His heart sank when he saw the contents. It was a list of names scrawled in ink, some crossed out, others underlined. Military officers, contractors, and then, at the bottom, a name that made Mark's stomach twist. Gerald Whitmore. Mark knew the man. 55, wealthy, owner of the largest lumber operation in Riverbend. Whitmore was respected in town, always dressed in pressed suits, silver hair combed back, known for his donations to local schools and churches. But Mark had also heard whispers contracts won too easily, men who worked for him disappearing after accidents in the mills. "Whitmore," Mark murmured. "What the hell is his name doing here?" Ethan's face darkened. "Because he's not just a businessman, he's part of it. My father found out Whitmore was laundering money for the shipments. That's why I've been running. Every town I go, someone's shadowing me. They work for him." Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Gerald Whitmore sits on the town council. He funds half the community projects. If he's involved, then no one's safe," Mark finished grimly. The lantern flickered as though stirred by unseen breath. Ranger growled low in his throat, eyes fixed again on the window. Outside, the drizzle blurred into gray curtains, and for a moment Mark thought he saw movement along the street, a figure watching before slipping out of sight. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and turned to Ethan. "If Whitmore's involved, then you're right. They won't stop until this is buried. But now we've got names, and names mean leverage. Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling. Leverage won't matter if they kill us first. Claire set a steadying hand on his arm. Then we make sure they don't. You've carried this alone too long, Ethan. Maybe it's time you trusted someone else. The rain outside quickened, rattling against the glass. Mark knew the storm hadn't passed. It had only shifted, and within Riverbend, where respect and corruption often shared the same table, the truth buried in those old letters was about to set something in motion none of them could control. Riverbend wore a mask of quiet respectability the following morning, but beneath the surface the storm had only shifted form. The streets glistened with last night's rainfall, and townsfolk went about their lives as if nothing unusual had passed. Yet, for Mark Reynolds, everything felt different. The old letters and the list from Ethan's bag had thrown shadows across names that once seemed untouchable. One name glared brightest: Gerald Whitmore. Mark had known of him for years. The man was 55, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair neatly combed back and expensive suits that contrasted sharply with the working clothes of Riverbend's mill hands. Whitmore had inherited his family's lumber business and expanded it until it dominated 3 valleys, supplying timber across the state. In public, he was seen as a benefactor donating funds to the church roof, sponsoring scholarships for local students, attending council meetings with the ease of a man born to authority. But whispers clung to him. Workers spoke of harsh contracts, of injuries hushed up, of wages that vanished after deductions. Mark had never caught him in anything criminal, but now the name on Ethan's list gave weight to all the rumors. Inside the substation, Ethan sat at the bench, clutching a tin mug of coffee Claire had pressed into his hands. He still looked fragile, his coat wrapped tightly around him, but his eyes were clear for the moment. When Mark mentioned Whitmore's name, the veteran's expression hardened. "That's him," Ethan said, his voice firm. "He's the one who sent men after me. My father traced payments, shell companies that linked back to him. Every time I moved towns, it was his men who showed up." Mark crossed his arms, uneasy. "Accusing Whitmore isn't simple. He has influence. Half this town sees him as its backbone. We'll need proof stronger than whispers and old letters." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Those letters are enough for them to want me dead. That tells you their worth." Before Mark could reply, Ranger barked sharply at the door. The German shepherd bolted outside, ignoring the drizzle still falling. Mark and Claire followed quickly. They found Ranger at the drainage ditch that cut along the side of the substation. A boy, no older than 8, had slipped on the wet grass and fallen into the shallow but fast-moving runoff. The current pulled at him, threatening to drag him toward a culvert clogged with debris. The boy's name was Tommy Carter, a neighbor's child. He was small, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, wearing a red flannel shirt far too thin for the damp morning. His family lived 2 streets over, known for struggling after his father lost his job at the mill. Ranger leaped into the ditch without hesitation, bracing his body against the current. He clamped his teeth gently on Tommy's sleeve and pulled with steady strength until the boy was dragged up onto the bank. Mark scrambled down to lift the child fully out, holding him close as Tommy coughed water and clung to his arm. Claire wrapped her coat around the boy, rubbing his back. "You're safe now, sweetheart. Just breathe." Tommy looked up at Ranger, wide-eyed. "He saved me," he whispered, still trembling. Mark ruffled the boy's hair and smiled faintly. "Yeah, he did." Ranger always knows when someone's in trouble. They walked Tommy home, his small hand gripping Mark's, while Ranger trotted at their side, tail wagging. His mother, a tired-looking woman with flowers still dusting her apron, wept as she hugged her son and thanked Mark and the dog over and over. Back at the substation, Ethan watched Ranger with something close to awe. That dog. He's more than just muscle. He feels things. He knew the boy was in danger before any of us. Mark nodded. "He saved me more times than I can count." Ranger doesn't hesitate. That's why I trust him. The moment of quiet was broken when a black car rolled slowly past the substation. Its tinted windows reflected the gray sky, offering no glimpse inside. Mark noticed Ethan stiffen instantly, his hand tightening around the mug. "That's them," Ethan muttered. "Whitmore's men." They circle, like wolves. Mark's eyes followed the car until it disappeared down the street. He couldn't be sure, but something about the slow pace, the silence of its passing, stirred the same unease that had settled in him the night before. "Then we'll find out," Mark said grimly. "If Whitmore has his hand in this, Riverbend isn't as safe as it looks. But I won't let shadows run this town." Ranger settled by the bench again, resting his head on his paws, though his eyes never left the window. The rain outside softened, but inside the substation, the storm was only just beginning. The night fell heavy over Riverbend, darker than usual, as if the town itself sensed something brewing beneath the calm surface. The rain had eased into a thin drizzle, and the main street lay hushed, lamps throwing pale circles of light into the fog that clung to the sidewalks. Inside the substation, the atmosphere was equally tense. The discovery of Whitmore's name and the black car's slow patrol the day before had left Mark on edge. Ranger, too, seemed restless, his ears twitching at every sound outside. Ethan sat near the desk, wrapped in his tattered coat, his eyes hollow yet restless, as though sleep had abandoned him completely. Claire, who had started visiting daily under the guise of health checks, was there again, quietly preparing a pot of tea on the small stove in the corner. She had slipped naturally into the rhythm of the place, her calm presence bridging the distance between lawman, veteran, and dog. The sudden crash shattered the fragile peace. Glass exploded inward as a rock hurtled through the front window, scattering shards across the wooden floor. Ranger lunged to his feet, barking furiously, his body a taut coil of defense. Mark grabbed his revolver, rushing to the broken window. The street outside lay empty, only the drizzle and the fog. On the floor lay the rock, wrapped in a piece of paper. Mark unfolded it under the lantern light. The words, scrawled in thick, angry strokes, read, "Send him out if you want to live." Ethan staggered forward, reading the note with wide eyes. His face crumpled, and he sank into the chair, his hands covering his face. "It's me. It's always me. They'll kill anyone who helps me. I should go. I should end this before more blood is spilled." Mark crouched in front of him, voice firm but not unkind. "You're not running, Ethan. That's exactly what they want. You've been chased long enough. This ends here with us." Ethan shook his head violently. "You don't understand." "They don't stop." "They never stop. I can't drag you down with me." At that moment, Ranger stepped forward, planting himself squarely in front of Ethan. He barked once, sharp and insistent, then again, louder, his amber eyes locked on the veteran. It was as though the dog himself refused to let Ethan move. Ethan stared at Ranger, breathing unevenly, and for the first time in days, a flicker of something other than fear crossed his face, confusion, maybe even gratitude. Mark placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "See? Even he knows you're meant to fight this, not run from it. As long as you're under this roof, you're not alone. I swear it." Claire approached quietly, carrying the steaming cup of tea. She set it in front of Ethan, her voice soft but resolute. "You've carried your father's burden alone for too long. You don't have to anymore. Let us help." Her words carried more than comfort. They carried history. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes clouded with memory. In Billings, years ago, she had been the one who coaxed him to eat when he'd refused food, who had sat with him through the darkest nights when flashbacks consumed him. Now, here she was again, in Riverbend, refusing to let him drown. Mark glanced between them. Realizing Claire had become more than a nurse to Ethan, she was a tether to his humanity. And to Mark himself, she had become something else entirely. Their eyes met for a brief moment, unspoken understanding passing between them. In the middle of shadows and threats, something fragile but real was forming. The hours dragged on, each creak of the old building drawing Ranger's growls. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the world. Ethan tried to rest, though every time his head dipped, he jolted awake. Mark remained vigilant by the window, his revolver on the desk within reach. Claire busied herself with notes, quietly documenting Ethan's symptoms, but her eyes lingered on him more than once, filled with determination. As midnight passed, Mark caught sight of a silhouette moving at the edge of the street. Tall, broad, pausing just long enough to let him know it was no accident. By the time he reached the door, the figure had melted into the fog. He shut the door firmly, locking it. "They're testing us," he muttered, "trying to scare us into surrendering him." Ethan's voice trembled. "It's working." Mark turned sharply. "No, not on my watch. I've dealt with threats before. They'll have to do more than throw rocks and scribble notes. If Whitmore's men want to fight, they'll find Riverbend doesn't bow so easily." Claire rose and put a hand on Mark's arm, steady but firm. "Just remember, they're not only testing you. They're testing him. Every time they strike, Ethan relives the war. We need to keep him standing as much as we need to keep him safe." Mark looked at her, then at Ethan, who sat slumped but alive, clutching the teacup as though it anchored him. He nodded slowly. "Then we'll stand together." Ranger lay down near the broken window, eyes still sharp, his body the first line of defense. In that dim-lit room, among broken glass and whispered vows, the 3 humans and 1 loyal dog braced themselves for whatever storm would come next. The air in the Riverbend carried a deceptive calm as night fell again, though Mark could feel tension in every shadow. The fog rolled back into the streets, curling around the lamps, swallowing the outlines of familiar buildings. After the rock and the threatening note, he had grown restless, unwilling to let Ethan linger inside the substation forever. When Ethan asked for a walk to clear his head, Mark agreed, partly because the veteran needed air, partly because he wanted to survey the town's edges himself. Ranger padded beside them, his paws leaving dark prints on the wet ground. They followed a dirt path leading out of town, toward the tree line where Riverbend's modest streets surrendered to the woods. The forest loomed dark and thick, branches dripping from the last rain. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around his frame, his eyes darting into the gloom as though expecting ghosts. Mark glanced at him. "You good to keep going?" Ethan gave a tight nod. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched, but there was determination there too. "I need to prove I can stand on my feet." Not just hide behind walls. They walked deeper until the hush of the town faded, replaced by the creak of branches and the distant rush of water. It was then Ranger stopped abruptly. His ears pricked, his muscles taut. Mark froze, his instincts kicking in. From the trees, figures emerged. 2 men in dark clothing, faces obscured by black cloth pulled up to their eyes. They carried themselves with confidence, the kind of assurance that came from rehearsed violence. One gripped a heavy iron rod, the other held a knife that glinted in the weak moonlight. Mark drew his revolver, his voice sharp. "Stay back!" But the men surged forward, and chaos broke loose. The one with the rod swung hard toward Mark's head. In that instant, Ranger leaped like a blur of muscle and teeth. He collided with the attacker's arm, snarling and dragging the swing off course. The rod crashed into the ground inches from Mark's leg. Mark stumbled back, firing a shot into the air as a warning. The second man lunged toward Ethan, blade raised. Ethan froze, breath quick and shallow, his mind flashing back to battlefields and ambushes half a world away. For a split second, he was back in Afghanistan, hearing the thunder of mortars and the screams of men. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for the pistol Mark had given him earlier, but the moment he felt its cold grip, instinct overtook him. He fired upward, the bullet cracking through branches. The report echoed, louder than the storm had been. The 2 attackers recoiled at the sound, startled by his defiance. Ranger bit down harder on the first man's arm, forcing him to drop the rod. Mark seized the opening, shoving the man against a tree, his revolver steady at the man's chest. The second figure hesitated, then cursed under his breath and yanked at his companion's shoulder. "Let's go!" the knife-wielder shouted, his voice muffled but young, no older than 30. The 2 men staggered into the trees, melting back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Ranger gave chase a few feet before Mark's command pulled him back. Breathing hard, Ethan lowered his gun, staring at his trembling hands. His eyes were wild, but for the first time there was something other than fear in them, resolve. I stood my ground, he muttered, almost in disbelief. Mark clapped him on the shoulder. You did more than that. You pushed them back. As the adrenaline ebbed, Mark noticed something glinting on the ground. He bent down and picked up a black smartphone, half buried in mud where one of the masked men had fallen during the scuffle. The screen was cracked, but still functioning. He pressed the side button, and it lit up. A thread of messages filled the screen. The last one read, "Keep him moving." Whitmore wants this done by week's end. Mark's jaw tightened. The evidence was undeniable now. Gerald Whitmore wasn't just a name on Ethan's list, he was the orchestrator. Ethan sank onto a fallen log, burying his face in his hands. You see now? It's him. It's always been him. Mark slipped the phone into his pocket, scanning the woods. Then we've got more than shadows. We've got proof, and proof is something we can fight with Ranger settled at Ethan's feet, pressing his weight against the veteran's trembling legs. Ethan looked down at the dog and managed a shaky laugh. You saved him, he murmured, scratching Ranger's head, and you saved me too. Mark stood tall, revolver still in his hand, his storm-gray eyes scanning the darkness. The town of Riverbend no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield, and Gerald Whitmore declared war. The substation felt heavier than the rain-soaked air outside. Mark sat at his desk, the cracked smartphone from the ambush lying face up beside the old lantern. Ethan hunched in the corner chair, coat still clinging to his frame, his hands twisting together in nervous knots. Ranger lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, amber eyes flicking between the two men as though sensing the tension. Claire stood near the stove, her blonde hair tied back, steam rising from the pot she was stirring. She had become a fixture in the station, her presence grounding them all in the middle of gathering storms. Mark finally broke the silence. You've carried these letters for years, Ethan. You've been hunted across towns, sleeping on benches and alleys because of what your father found, but if we're going to survive what Whitmore has planned, I need the full truth. No half-shadows. All of it. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. His eyes drifted toward the rain-spattered window before he spoke, voice low and raw. My father, Colonel James Walker, wasn't just a soldier. He believed in rules, in honor. He commanded men in supply operations overseas. But he discovered things weren't adding up. Weapons shipments went missing. Reports got falsified. He traced it back to a network officers, contractors, businessmen. He said they were selling American weapons to the highest bidder, turning war into profit. Mark leaned forward. And Whitmore? He was one of the middlemen, Ethan said. My father followed the money back here to Riverbend, to that lumber empire Whitmore runs. On the surface it was timber exports, but inside the crates were rifles, munitions, gear. My father had evidence and he meant to expose them. Ethan's voice cracked, his hands trembling harder. Then one night, his jeep went off the road outside Helena. They called it a training accident, but he wasn't on duty, Mark. He was driving home. And I know he wasn't drunk. Someone forced him off that road. He died because he wouldn't stay quiet. The words hung in the air like thunder, yet to break. Claire set down the spoon she held and walked closer, her expression stricken. She knelt beside Ethan, speaking softly. When you were in Billings, you muttered pieces of this, but no one listened. They wrote it off as trauma talking. Mark felt the burn of anger in his chest. He had suspected corruption, but Ethan's story stretched far beyond Riverbend. If Whitmore has ties at that level, then this isn't just one crooked businessman. He's connected to officials in Helena, maybe even higher. That explains why no one in town dares question him. He isn't just feared here, he's protected from above. Ethan shook his head slowly, his eyes haunted. My father wanted me to finish what he started, but I couldn't. I ran, and they've been chasing me ever since. Every time I thought I'd found safety, someone new appeared, always watching. Always pushing me back into the dark. Claire's gaze hardened. Then maybe it's time we stopped letting them decide the story. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a worn folder, its edges frayed from years of use. Mark raised an eyebrow. "These are medical records," Claire explained. "From my volunteer years at the VA hospital. I kept copies notes I wasn't supposed to, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling they mattered." She spread the papers across Mark's desk. Typed reports, stamped with military insignias, filled the pages. She pointed to one in particular. "This is your father's last health evaluation. No signs of alcohol abuse, no neurological conditions that would cause sudden accidents. And here—" She flipped to another page, her finger pressing to the margin. "He reported being followed. Documented paranoia, but not unfounded. He even mentioned Gerald Whitmore by name, noting unusual transfers of funds tied to shipments. It matches exactly what Ethan just told us." Ethan stared at the pages as though they were ghosts. His voice faltered. You kept this? All these years?" Claire's expression softened. "Because I believed you, Ethan. I believed your father's death wasn't what they said it was. And now, with these letters, your father's suspicion becomes undeniable proof." Mark gathered the papers, laying them alongside the phone and the bundle of old letters. "This is more than a local problem. Whitmore is tied into a network that stretches beyond Riverbend. State officials, contractors, maybe federal. But if we can connect these dots, if we can prove this evidence is genuine, we can tear down his shield." Ethan's breathing steadied slightly, though his eyes still glistened. "He died for this, Mark. My father died so the truth could come out. If we do nothing, then I failed him all over again." Mark placed a hand firmly on the table, his storm-gray eyes burning. "Then we don't do nothing. We fight. We use these letters, these records, that phone. We don't just protect you, Ethan, we expose them." Ranger, as if sensing the vow, lifted his head and gave a low bark. Ethan managed a weak smile at the dog before lowering his gaze. "It's bigger than us. They won't stop, but maybe with this, we stand a chance." Claire placed her hand gently over Ethan's. "Your father believed in justice, and now, finally, justice has a voice." The rain outside fell harder again, rattling the windows, but inside the substation a different storm gathered, one not of weather, but of truth, revelation, and the dangerous promise of confrontation yet to come. The substation had become a fortress of sorts. Its wooden walls creaked under the weight of the storm outside, but inside, the air was sharpened by resolve. Mark spread the documents across the desk, and the letters, the military records, the cracked smartphone, all the evidence that tied Gerald Whitmore to a network that stretched beyond Riverbend. Claire stood beside him, organizing the pages into folders, while Ranger prowled the room, restless, ears pricked as if he already sensed what was coming. Ethan sat nearby, posture straighter than Mark had seen since they'd first pulled him off the steps in the storm. His beard still cast shadows across his weathered face, but his eyes burned with something new. Not fear, but clarity. "We get this into federal hands," he said quietly, "and Whitmore's empire starts to crumble." Mark nodded. "I've made a call. The state police are coordinating with federal agents. They'll be here by dawn. All we have to do is hold out until then." But dawn was still hours away. The first sign came with the low growl from Ranger. His body stiffened, tail rigid, as headlights cut through the rain outside. More than one vehicle, moving too slow to be casual. Mark blew out the lantern flame to throw the room into shadow, his revolver already in hand. The crunch of boots on gravel followed. Voices carried, muffled but sharp. And then, the front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Mark hissed, "Positions!" Claire ducked behind the desk, clutching a metal flashlight like a weapon. Ethan rose to his feet, hand trembling but firm on the pistol Mark had given him days ago. Ranger stood guard at the door, muscles coiled, teeth bared. The door exploded inward. Whitmore himself stepped across the threshold, a hulking presence in his tailored overcoat. his silver hair plastered by rain. At 55, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed money and power made him untouchable. Behind him came 4 men, each broad-shouldered and rough, dressed in dark work clothes, hands gripping bats and knives. One, a younger man with a scar across his cheek, carried a shotgun. Whitmore's voice boomed, smooth as oil. "Deputy Reynolds, you've made a mistake crossing me. Hand over Walker, and maybe I let the rest of you live." Mark raised his revolver. "This is your last warning, Whitmore. Leave now, while you still can." The scarred man sneered. "Or what? You're outnumbered." The clash came fast. One of Whitmore's men lunged toward Claire, swinging a crowbar. Ranger leapt, jaws clamping down on the man's arm with bone-crushing force. The thug screamed, the crowbar clattering to the floor. Claire scrambled back, her face pale, but her eyes defiant. Another man charged at Mark, swinging a knife. Mark fired once, the bullet splintering the wall inches from the attacker's head, a deliberate miss, a warning shot that froze the man in place. "Try me again, and I don't miss," Mark growled. Whitmore, furious, turned his cold gaze on Ethan. "You should have stayed in the gutter where you belonged. Now you've dragged decent people into your ruin." For a heartbeat, Ethan faltered. The rain outside, the shouting, the crash of boots, it threatened to drag him back to Afghanistan, to firefights and chaos. But then he looked at Ranger, teeth bared in defense of Claire, and at Mark, standing tall despite the odds. His father's face came to him in memory, proud and unyielding. Ethan straightened. For the first time in years, his voice did not shake. "No more running." He raised his pistol, fired into the ceiling, the crack of the shot echoing like thunder. Dust rained down from the rafters. Whitmore and his men froze, startled. Ethan stepped forward, eyes blazing. "Drop your weapons. Now. Or the next bullet finds its mark." The scarred man cursed, but Mark swung his revolver toward him, steady as stone. Ranger growled low, dragging his prey to the floor. The room held in tense silence. Then, flashing red and blue lights cut through the storm outside. Sirens wailed, tires screeched. The front yard flooded with uniformed state police, weapons drawn, floodlights slicing into the darkness. "Police! Drop your weapons!" a commanding voice bellowed. Whitmore's face drained of color. For the first time he looked less like an untouchable titan and more like a man cornered. One by one, his men lowered their weapons, hands lifted. Ranger released his grip, stepping back but keeping his eyes on them. 2 officers entered, cuffing Whitmore's men with swift efficiency. Another approached Whitmore, reading him his rights. He tried to sneer, tried to bark orders, but no one listened. The silver-haired mogul of Riverbend was just another criminal now. Ethan lowered his pistol slowly, his chest heaving. For the first time in a decade, he felt the weight lift, not gone, but lighter. He looked at Mark and managed a broken smile. "We did it." My father. He'd finally be at peace. Mark holstered his revolver, clapping a hand to Ethan's shoulder. "No, Ethan. You did it. You stood tall, and you faced him." Claire stepped closer, brushing glass from her coat, her eyes glistening. "You didn't just survive tonight. You fought back. Outside, the storm began to break, the rain easing into a light drizzle. Riverbend lay quiet again, but this time the silence carried something new. Justice. The trial of Gerald Whitmore shook Riverbend to its core. For decades, his name had been spoken with respect, even awe. But in the courthouse at Helena, stripped of his fine overcoats and power, he looked like nothing more than a man cornered by his own greed. Witnesses came forward, evidence stacked higher each day, and when Ethan Walker took the stand, his voice steady and clear, the room fell silent. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan's words were not dismissed as paranoia. They were truth. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. Guilty on all counts, illegal arms trafficking, conspiracy and manslaughter tied to James Walker's death. Whitmore's sentencing sent ripples across the state. Officials who had once shielded him were pulled into the spotlight, forced to answer for their part. What had begun in shadows ended in full daylight. Back in Riverbend, the town itself seemed transformed. People whispered about the night the substation had been attacked and how Deputy Mark Reynolds, his loyal dog Ranger, the veteran Ethan Walker, and the nurse Claire Dawson had stood their ground against overwhelming odds. Ranger, in particular, became a legend. Children stopped on the street to pet him, and townsfolk left biscuits at the station door as tokens of gratitude. To them, he wasn't just a dog. He was the four-legged guardian who had saved Riverbend. Ethan's life, however, was the most changed. With Whitmore's conviction, he was no longer a fugitive hunted by invisible hands. Instead, he was honored as a key witness who had carried evidence that dismantled a criminal empire. At first, the attention unsettled him. Applause felt foreign after years of suspicion and exile. Yet, with Claire's calm guidance and Mark's steady presence, he began to settle into a new rhythm. Claire often walked with him to the Riverbend Veterans Center, a modest brick building at the edge of town where a director named Harold Jenkins welcomed Ethan with open arms. Harold was in his late 60s, with a gentle demeanor and a limp from his own service in Vietnam. His clothes were a simple corduroy jacket, faded trousers, and always a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. Having spent decades helping veterans reintegrate, Harold knew the weight Ethan carried without needing many words. "You've seen the dark and lived to tell it," Harold said when he offered Ethan a position helping run outreach programs. "That means you've got something every lost soldier needs, proof that survival is possible." For Ethan, the job was more than work. It was redemption. Each day he spoke with younger veterans haunted by nightmares like his own, and slowly he began to heal alongside them. Mark and Claire, meanwhile, found their lives intertwined beyond the substation walls. Their bond had grown from shared danger, but in quieter days it deepened into something tender. Claire's laughter softened the edges of Mark's otherwise rigid days, and Mark's steady, unwavering loyalty gave her a sense of safety she had long craved. They started sharing dinners, lingering conversations under the porch light, and the easy comfort of silence that only true partners know. Riverbend itself honored their defenders. A mural was painted on the wall of the town library, a depiction of Ranger mid-leap, teeth bared, standing between danger and the innocent. Below it, words in bold: "Courage has many forms." The morning after Whitmore's sentencing, the storm clouds that had clung to Riverbend finally broke. Sunlight spilled across the valley, glinting on the damp streets, warming the rooftops and filling the air with a sense of cleansing renewal. At the substation, Mark stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand. Beside him, Claire leaned against the railing, her blonde hair catching the early light. Ethan joined them, his posture no longer hunched but upright, a quiet dignity settling back into his frame. Ranger lay at their feet, tail sweeping lazily across the porch. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer heavy with fear, but filled with promise. Ethan breathed deep, the fresh air carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. "Feels different," he said softly. Mark nodded. "That's because it is. The past doesn't own you anymore." Claire reached out, her hand brushing Mark's, and for the first time she didn't pull away. Ethan noticed, and a faint smile touched his lips. In that moment, with the sun rising over Riverbend, 3 souls and 1 loyal German shepherd stood together, bound not by fear but by the trials they had survived. The ghosts of the past had finally loosened their grip. Ahead lay healing, community, and hope. The storm had passed. A new dawn had come. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant fields but inside the human heart. Ethan's journey reminds us that even in the darkest storms, God can bring light, healing, and new beginnings. It is a miracle when fear turns into courage, when brokenness finds strength again, and when a weary soul discovers peace. In our everyday lives, we may not face the same dangers, but we all carry struggles, doubts, and silent wounds. Just as Ethan found hope through friendship, loyalty, and faith, we too can believe that God is working behind the scenes, turning pain into purpose. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Comment below and tell us what part gave you hope, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. May God bless every viewer who watched this far. If you believe in miracles and in His power to heal every broken soul, type Amen in the comments and let your faith be a light for others.